Well, let's talk about them. See what $2,600 buys you. So these are the Edelbrock heads, the Magnum version. The Edelbrock heads, these are RPMs. So not Victors or anything. Now these are stud type, but on these heads, they take small block Chevy rock arms, more readily available, larger selection, small block Chevy rock arms. So I'm going to go with 1.6s. Obviously it's small block Chevy, so there's 1.7s, 1.8s. May have to do a little push rod clearancing if you get into the bigger ratios. But I'm going to go with some 1.6, and based off of some other videos and some testing, I'm going to go with the Scorpions. They're blue anodized 1.6s, about a little better than 360 bucks or so at Summit. That's based on some videos I've seen where, you know, they're testing ratios, and they'll test a bunch of 1.6 ratio rock arms, and they'll find anywhere from like a 1.43 true ratio to, you know, a 1.63, 1.65 true ratio, all on rockers that are sold as 1.6s. So real quick, I guess we'll get into the valves. So let's talk about the valves. So here's the exhaust valve, and I'm not unhappy with the exhaust valve. It's got a pretty big margin there. And so I think what I may do is I may have the exhaust valves, I want to say back cut, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to do it on the face of the valve there. I'm going to do it on that margin to help flow around the valve as it's exiting the chamber. So I'm not going to cut on the back side of the valve here. I'm actually going to cut this margin down from the face of the valve. That's about all I'll do to the exhaust valve. Now the intake valve, there's not a lot of sealing area. I mean, it's going to seal fine, but my disappointment there is I would like to put a back cut on the intake valve, and I just don't think they leave me enough material. After, you know, you're going to look at the area that the seat makes contact, I don't think they leave me enough material to put a back cut on the intake valve. So there may be nothing I can do with the intake valve. Now I put some Dykem on the exhaust ports. The exhaust ports are shit. You know, I'm not going to lie to you. They need a lot of work. So the reason I marked here, right, you can see where I stopped. So here's my header gasket where it sits. And as you can see, it starts to curve around here, and then it basically loses it in the shitty casting. So I'm already too wide here in the casting. Comes back in about there. And you can see a slouch in this port. Now it's only present in that port. It's not present in this port. And in this port, my gasket actually follows, you can see a little line here where my gasket is, and then it follows this wall. It's almost right on the money already. So this port I'm not unhappy with. Now my marks here are where I start to lose it when I held the gasket up to the header. This area here matches the header well. But down here on the header, it doesn't do me any good. So there's nothing for me to gasket match from here down, because the header slouches in here basically where they welded the tube. And so if I opened anything up in this area, it's just going to run into the flange and the weld on the header, and it's not going to benefit me any. You know, you got to think of the way these things flow. So I always want my opening on my header tube to be slightly, you know, when I say slightly, I'm talking a 30/2 of an inch. I want my header tube slightly bigger than my exhaust port. And the reason I want that is because the exhaust, as it's coming out of the exhaust wall, I don't want it to hit any of the header tube anywhere. So I always want my header tube to be a hair bigger than the exhaust, and the reverse is on the intake. So on the intake, when I gasket match my heads, I always want to be a step bigger, you know, a 32nd or a 16th of an inch bigger on my head than on my intake manifold, because there's a small amount of shift. You know, when you go to put on your intake manifold, there's a small amount of shift there, and I don't want to create a situation where the air coming down the intake runner runs into a small wall. You know, let's come around to the intakes here. I don't want to create a situation where my intake runner, say, is that much wider, and then this little wall here, that it hits the wall, it kicks up and creates a little bit of turbulence, and then that disrupts my flow. So I always want to be a little bit bigger around the port of my head than I want to be on the intake manifold itself. So let's not get carried away yet. Let's back up to the pour exhaust. So this one has got a slouch. This one does not. So there's some inconsistencies in the casting. You can see typical Edelbrock, how they've come in with their CNC program and done what they consider to be a gasket match. But it's pretty poor, and there's a ridge here, a high point. I mean, there's plenty of work to do on these. Definitely wouldn't recommend running them out of the box. Now, the other thing that we'll get into, so you can see how my port, my gasket match will come down all the way down here. I'm not going to do that. I'm almost never going to touch the floor. Okay, all my gasket matching is going to be concentrated on the roof and on the width, and it's almost never going to be down on the floor there. The reason is, so as you come around the short side, there's a hump here, and most of your exhaust is going to hit the roof, okay, and it's going to come up here in the port. It's not going to make this curve back down here. You're not going to get any real flow down there. So for me to grind out this 1/4 inch of exhaust port here to match my gasket match, that's not going to do anything for me. The majority of my flow is going to be up in this upper, you know, 3/4 or 7/8 of the port, just due to the design of the head. But up here, this area, this is going to make a pretty significant difference. So you can see I've got some grinding to do there. In an ideal world, if I was going crazy with this, I would come in here and I would TIG it up and actually build up this wall so that I can get a straight line from that point to that point and really match my gasket well. Because this right here, so if this is my gasket and you can see my port, then this small notch here where it's slouched out, that is going to hit my header tube, and that is going to cause turbulence. So I may TIG up, if it's just this one port out of the 2 heads, I may TIG that up a little bit and try to make that a little bit better. This is a street engine, so I don't want to get too carried away. Although when I do say this is a street engine, I would like to see between 800 and 1,000 horse out of it. It's a 408 360, you know, 5.9 Magnum base stroker, and it's got a 7582 turbo on it. So I'd like to see between 800 and 1,000 horse. So I may put a little bit more effort into these heads. Definitely not going to run them the way they are. There's definitely a lot of work to be done. Let's flip them around to the chamber side here. So on the chamber, let's get in there and see, you know, where they did a pretty poor job. They put the stud for the rocker, which I never mind the hole coming through into the intake port. I oftentimes have, you know, rocker studs come through, but they could have cleaned it up. There is some jagged metal there that could break off and go into my engine. So at the very least, it's going to need to be touched with a sand roll. I like the shape of the bowl. I like the way they fit it to the seat. You know, shouldn't be a whole lot to do in here. A quick cleanup with a sand roll. I'll take my percentage measurements. But so far on the intake bowl, let's say, I'm not too disappointed. I'm not too disappointed yet. I like what they did with the chamber here versus stock Magnum head. You know, on stock Magnums, they're going to come more straight across there. I like that they've given it some room for your flow. I'll clean up the spark plug boss a little bit, but it's not going to take too much. Really not a whole lot of work to do. It's mostly just going to be kind of polish the chambers. On the intakes, I would do some deshrouding. You know, I put some die chem, put some dowel pins in it, and mark out your head gasket, mark out where your bore is going to be. Now, when you do that, you need to pay attention to your bore, and the reason I say that is because on the older engines, they're going to sell the head gasket for a 60 or 70 or 80 thousandths over bore. You know, on the older engines, you get one gasket. And so whether your engine is a standard bore, a 30 thousandths over rebuild, a 40 thousandths rebuild, they just sell you one gasket. They go the max 60 or 70 thousandths overboard to make sure that it doesn't overhang the cylinder, and you run that on everything, but you end up with a little bit of dead space. So if your gasket is made for a 60 thousandths overbore and you have a 30 thousandths overbore engine, then you've got a little bit of dead space between the head and the gasket. The reason I say that is you don't want to hold up your head gasket 60 or 70 thousandths overbore, mark it out with your die chem and scribe it, and then come in here and unshroud your valve to that 60 or 70 thousandths, and then put it on your block with a 30 thousandths overbore or a standard bore, and now you've created an issue because you've made the chamber of your head bigger than your cylinder. So, you know, pay attention to the math on things like that. The exhaust, I don't think I would unshroud these exhausts. I don't see anything, and these are already pretty laid back. If you go back and you look at my video I did with a factory iron Magnum head and some of the areas that I laid back and worked down, this is already pretty nice out of the box. So I really don't see anything I would do there aside from just come in and clean up the casting with a sand roll, you know, a 120 grit sand roll, and just smooth out the casting. That's about all I do, but I would consider opening up and deshrouding some of the intake depending on how the layout works once I put a head gasket on there and scribe it and see what I have to work with or not work with. But this design of the chamber I'm really happy with. The way the seats are and everything, I don't see any problems, so I'm not against any of that. Even the guide boss and stuff, I'm fine with it. I'm happier with the intake than I am with the exhaust. The exhaust has got a lot of cleanup to do. It's really got, I know you never touch the short side, but really, I mean, there's some short side that can be cut down there and could definitely increase the cross section, wouldn't hurt. So I'll spend way more time on the exhaust port than I will on the intake. Now, that being said, so these are your oil drains. Okay, this is where your oil drains from up in your head. And that's something that I'll work on. So let's look at that. Okay, so there's your oil drain. Let's see if I can kind of get what's a straight shot there. That's something that I'll definitely come in here and round off the edges and smooth everything down. I'll smooth the casting, I'll polish it what I can, because I want to drain the oil from the heads. I don't want it sitting around my valves. So I'll come in here and I will polish everything and make the oil flow as good as I can. You know, when these are sitting on an engine, this is sort of a high point, so you're always going to end up with some oil sitting down here. So the more I can direct it back in, the more I can speed up the flow of oil, because the rough casting is going to hold on to the oil and it's going to slow down the flow of oil, which I don't want. I'll come in here with a burr, you know, and I'll open that up a little bit. I'll smooth out around it and just try to direct the flow of oil as easily as possible into the oil returns there, or the drain for the top of the head. So the push rod holes on these, I could come in and sleeve them. I don't think I'm going to get that carried away on this head, but definitely I'm not happy with the intakes at all. I'll measure and I'll see, and again, you can see a slouch port just based on the casting and their CNC design. There's a lot to be cleaned up there. Deeper inside the port itself, I'm really not unhappy with it. But I'm going to be taking my measurements on the pinch here, and I'm going to see, I'm not going to push it, but I would definitely like to open up the pinch. You know, 50 thousandths, 100 thousandths, somewhere in that range, I would like to open up the pinch. Again, this is 408 inches, and I'm going to need, you know, I'm going to need the flow out of it. On a 360, I made 318, you know, a 5.2 Magnum. You might just gasket match it and roll with it. But on a 408, I think it's going to need some work. Again, you can see some of the rough shit there that they left from the stud from when they drilled and tapped the hole. So there's things to clean up. I would not run them out of the box. I pulled some springs. I'm going to tear the rest of this head down, and I'm going to check my installed height here, and then I'm going to put them on a spring tester and see what kind of pressures I'm working with. And then take a look at my cam, see what my cam is calling for, and then decide if I need to shim them or change springs or what's going to be necessary. I don't think I need to change springs. It's going to be a fairly mild cam, being that it's a street engine and a turbo build. You know, it's only going to be like 224, maybe 230 degrees of duration at 50 thousandths. Lift will be in the 550 thousandths range. So it's not going to be a huge cam. It shouldn't need a lot of spring, but you know, while I'm doing the work here and I've got the springs off the head anyways, I might as well verify what my pressures are and verify that, you know, I'm putting together the proper package. Anyhow, I'm disappointed in the $2,600. I think maybe there's some better options. I'm not even sold on the Trick Flows. I love Trick Flow as a company, and I definitely love what they do for the big block Mopar. I think that was a game changer for the majority of people on the street. I've got several set of Trick Flows. I have not bought the Trick Flow small blocks, and the reason I didn't buy the Trick Flow small blocks, I think they're probably every bit as good of a head as the Edelbrocks. The reason I didn't on this particular build is I already had a Magnum pattern M1 intake, and I wanted to stay with the Magnum pattern stuff. This is for my 2001 Durango RT 5.9 all-wheel drive. So I wanted to stay Magnum pattern, and the Edelbrock offers that. Now the Trick Flows, if you do your research, even though they say you can use them on a Magnum or an LA, they will physically work with the block. But in doing so, if you put them on a Magnum, they switch you over to the LA pattern intake is the only way they're offered. So even though they advertise them as they'll work on a Magnum, and yes, they will work on a Magnum, you have to run an LA style intake manifold. You also run LA style rocker arms. So to me, that was a drawback because I'd already had the Magnum intake. You know, I think that's a good idea, so I'm not knocking TrickFlow, because there's a very poor selection of Magnum intakes out there. There's a much greater selection of LA intakes. There's a greater selection of LA rocker arms. So if I were building a Magnum, you know, and I went with the TrickFlows, I think that would definitely open up the possibilities for the majority of people to find an intake and find rocker arms that work. I think TrickFlow was smart in what they did. But on my particular build, I wanted to stay with Magnum stuff. And so that's why I went with the Edelbrocks. My opinion, really, after doing a lot of research, if I had to pick what I would call a badass head for, you know, the small block Mopars, guys that are really serious about power, without, you know, having a gold mine in their backyard, I would go with the Edelbrock Victor heads. I think the Edelbrock Victor heads are probably the best thing going. Definitely better than the TrickFlows. You know, when you look at terms of CFM and flow numbers, I think these Edelbrock RPM heads really don't outflow an iron Magnum head. Not stock for stock, but I'm saying when you port and work a factory Magnum head, or an EQ head, or a LAX, MAX head, the iron heads, I don't think this Edelbrock really beats it. I don't think this Edelbrock really outflows a heavily worked, heavily ported, you know, look at some of Charlie's stuff or Eric's stuff. I don't think these aluminum Edelbrocks really shine compared to a heavily worked iron head. And definitely because these aren't good out of the box, because you've still got to work these out of the box, no different than you've got to work an iron head. I think your only real gain on the Edelbrocks, and even the TrickFlows for that matter, I think your only real gain is a nicer chamber design, but really just less weight. CFM wise, I don't think you know, there's a big difference between these and some heavily worked iron heads. Look at the stuff, some of the stuff Charlie's doing lately. You'll see Charlie opened up his chamber here, very similar, on some EQ heads, I think. I think they were the EQs. He's been playing with several different ones lately, but like I said, for my money, if I were doing it again, I think I would go Edelbrock Victor and probably be a lot more impressed than I'm going to be with these heads. But for a street head, this is going to work fine. So that's where I'm at. I'll get them apart and get some cross-section measurements and move forward. Thanks for watching, guys.